The moment Angel Reese was traded, something didn't just shift within the Chicago sky, it snapped into an entirely different reality. Not gradually, not through the usual slow rebuild that teams try to sell to their fans, but instantly. One move, one decision, and suddenly the entire perception of the franchise changed overnight. For 2 seasons, Chicago had been stuck in a strange place, visible, talked about, even statistically intriguing, but never truly respected as a destination. And then, in what felt like a single breath, that identity disappeared. The hesitation surrounding the franchise was gone, the doubt was gone, and in its place, something far more dangerous for the rest of the league began to form. Because if you just look at the surface, none of this should have happened. You don't move on from a player like Reese without a very specific reason. A 2-time All-Star, one of the most dominant rebounders the league had seen in years. A player whose numbers, at a glance, suggested she was the foundation of something bigger. Those are the kinds of players teams hold on to, build around, defend publicly even when things aren't working. They don't quietly ship them out for future assets. They don't make fast decisions with no visible negotiation. And they definitely don't do it without extracting immediate proven talent in return. But Chicago did exactly that. No drawn-out process, no public tug-of-war, just a move that felt final. And that's where things started to get uncomfortable, because almost immediately after Reese was gone, something even harder to explain began happening. Players who, for the past 2 years, had shown little to no interest in Chicago suddenly started moving toward it, not slowly, not cautiously, but decisively. These weren't fringe additions or low-risk signings. These were established names, proven players, the kind of talent that usually takes months of persuasion, the kind that weighs every option before committing. And yet, here they were, choosing Chicago without hesitation, as if something that once held them back had suddenly been removed. That kind of reaction doesn't come from a single roster adjustment. It doesn't come from swapping one player for another or freeing up cap space. Around the league, players talk, agents talk, information moves fast, but more importantly, it moves quietly. Decisions like these are rarely based only on what happens on the court. They're shaped by what people hear, what they feel, and what they believe about an organization when the cameras aren't rolling. And whatever that belief was about Chicago before the trade, it clearly wasn't strong enough to bring people in. But the second Reese was gone, that belief changed. So now the focus shifts away from the obvious, because this isn't really about the trade itself anymore. It's about the reaction to it. It's about why a team that had been struggling to attract talent suddenly became one of the most appealing situations in the league. It's about what players saw, or maybe what they stopped seeing, the moment that move was made. And more than anything, it's about the possibility that the biggest factor in Chicago's stagnation was never fully visible to the public in the first place. And once you start looking at it from that angle, the entire situation begins to feel different, less like a questionable front office decision and more like a necessary reset. Because teams don't just gamble their future on draft picks without a reason. They don't willingly take a step back unless they believe it's the only way to move forward. Which raises the question that nobody inside the league is eager to answer directly, but everyone seems to understand. What exactly changed the moment Angel Reese left, and why did it change everything? On the surface, everything about Angel Reese looked exactly like what a franchise is supposed to build around. The numbers were loud, consistent, and impossible to ignore. Night after night, she filled the stat sheet in a way that demanded attention. Double-doubles stacking up, rebound totals climbing into elite territory, and accolades arriving almost immediately. 2 All-Star selections in her first 2 seasons, a historic streak of double-doubles as a rookie, back-to-back years leading the league in rebounding. If you only looked at those figures, the conclusion felt obvious. Chicago had its cornerstone, its identity, its future. And that's exactly where the illusion began. Because while those individual numbers were rising, something else was moving in the opposite direction. The Chicago sky weren't improving, they weren't stabilizing, they weren't even hovering around competitiveness. They were losing consistently, decisively, and without any real signs of progress. A 13-win season followed by an even worse 10-win campaign. No playoff appearances, no late-season push, no stretch of games that hinted at a breakthrough, just a steady pattern of results that didn't match what the stat sheet was suggesting.
That contradiction is where things started to get uncomfortable. Because in basketball, especially at the professional level, production is supposed to translate. Star players are supposed to lift the floor of a team, not just inflate their own numbers. They create advantages, open opportunities, and make the players around them better. But in Chicago's case, that connection never fully formed. Reese's presence was undeniable in the box score, yet strangely disconnected from the outcomes that actually define success. And the deeper you look, the harder it becomes to ignore that gap, because a stat line can tell you what happened, but it doesn't always tell you how it happened or what it actually meant in the flow of a game. Rebounds count the same whether they stop an opponent's possession or come from your own missed shot. Points look identical whether they come efficiently within the offense or after multiple failed attempts in the same sequence. On paper, it all adds up the same. In reality, it doesn't. That's the difference between production and impact. One fills a spreadsheet, the other changes games. For 2 seasons, Chicago lived inside that difference. They had a player who looked like a star in every statistical category that matters, yet the team itself kept drifting further away from relevance. And eventually, that raises a question that numbers alone can't answer, whether those stats were actually building something or just masking the fact that nothing was being built at all. And once that question starts to surface, it leads directly to the next layer of the story, because the numbers weren't just misleading, they were hiding something much deeper. But once you move past the surface-level numbers, the picture around Angel Reese starts to change, and not in a subtle way. Because while the stat sheet painted the image of dominance, the efficiency behind those numbers told a completely different story. This wasn't just about missed shots here and there. It was about a pattern that kept showing up every single game, quietly dragging down possessions in ways that don't always make the highlight reels. Start with the shooting. For a player who operates primarily in the paint, where shots are supposed to be the most reliable, Reese's percentages were unexpectedly low. Finishing around the rim, the area where elite post players separate themselves, became a consistent struggle. Layups didn't fall at the rate they should. Close-range attempts turned into second and third chances. And while those extra efforts sometimes boosted her rebound totals, they also revealed something more concerning. The original opportunities weren't being converted. That's where the rebounding numbers start to lose some of their shine, because a significant portion of those offensive rebounds didn't come from battling opponents for position, they came from recovering her own misses. Statistically, they count the same, a rebound is a rebound, but in terms of impact, there's a huge difference between extending a possession after a strong defensive contest and resetting your own missed attempt multiple times in a row. There were sequences where Reese would miss, grab the rebound, miss again, and repeat the cycle within a single possession. On paper, it looked like dominance. In reality, it was inefficiency looping in real time. And then came the turnovers. As her role expanded, so did the mistakes. The ball started to stick. Decisions became rushed. Possessions that already lacked efficiency ended even faster. By her second season, her turnover rate had climbed into one of the highest ranges in the league. And unlike high-usage players who offset turnovers by generating elite offense, Chicago wasn't getting that return. These weren't high-risk, high-reward sequences. They were empty possessions on a team that could least afford them. The contrast becomes even sharper when you look across the league at someone like Caitlin Clark. Clark also turned the ball over at a high rate, but the context was completely different. She was orchestrating an entire offense, stretching defenses far beyond their comfort zones, and directly creating scoring opportunities for everyone around her. The mistakes came as part of an aggressive system that produced results. In Reese's case, the turnovers didn't unlock anything. They simply ended possessions that were already struggling to produce points. And that's where the efficiency problem becomes impossible to ignore, because it wasn't just about missing shots or committing turnovers. It was about how those moments stacked up over the course of a game, quietly shifting momentum in the wrong direction. Every missed layup that turned into multiple attempts slowed the offense down. Every turnover shortened an already fragile possession. And over time, those small inefficiencies added up to something much bigger. A team that couldn't find rhythm, couldn't sustain scoring, and couldn't close the gap in games that were still within reach. But even that wasn't the full story, because as damaging as those on-court issues were, they still don't explain how everything unraveled so quickly behind the scenes. And that's where things start to move away from numbers entirely, into a space where stats don't exist, but impact becomes impossible to ignore.
But the deeper this story goes, the less it becomes about numbers, and the more it starts to revolve around what was happening behind closed doors. Because across the league, there's been quiet chatter about Angel Reese that never fully made headlines, but never really went away either. Nothing officially confirmed, nothing directly stated by the organization in clear terms, but enough consistent reports, enough repeated whispers that it's impossible to ignore completely. And when you piece those moments together, a very different picture begins to form. It's been said that tension inside the Chicago Sky locker room wasn't just occasional, it was building. Slowly at first, then more noticeably as the season went on. One of the most talked about situations involved Courtney Vandersloot, a veteran with deep roots in Chicago and a reputation that carries real weight around the league. According to multiple reports and insider discussions, comments were made about her age and ability, suggesting she was past her prime and no longer someone the team could rely on. Whether those comments were taken out of context or not, the fact that they circulated at all was enough to shift the dynamic. In a league where veteran respect matters, that kind of perception can spread fast, and it rarely lands well. And it didn't stop there. Another moment that reportedly raised eyebrows involved Kamilla Cardoso, a player widely viewed as a key piece of Chicago's future. There's been a lot of talk suggesting that during a team situation, Cardoso reached a point where she simply walked away, literally removing herself from the moment rather than staying engaged. Now, to be clear, there's no single official explanation for what led to that situation, but the fact that it happened at all, and that it became part of the conversation around the team, added to the growing sense that something wasn't clicking internally. Then there were the visible moments, the kind you can't fully hide. Body language during games, frustration that didn't look isolated, sequences where players seemed disconnected, not just strategically but emotionally. None of these moments alone prove anything definitive, but when they start stacking up, when they align with what's being quietly discussed off the court, they begin to feel less like coincidences and more like symptoms of something bigger. At one point, things escalated enough that Reese faced a team suspension, along with a separate league-related issue tied to technical fouls. Again, suspensions don't happen in a vacuum. Teams exhaust options before getting to that stage: conversations, internal adjustments, attempts to stabilize the situation. So when it reaches that level, it usually means whatever was happening had moved beyond something easily managed. And then came the part that really shifted perception. Reports surfaced, some from media outlets, others from individuals close to the situation, suggesting that frustration inside the locker room had reached a breaking point. Words like difficult environment started appearing more frequently in discussions. Even more serious labels were mentioned in certain circles, though it's important to emphasize that much of this remains unverified and based on sources rather than official statements. Still, in professional sports, when teammates begin speaking out, even indirectly, it signals that whatever was happening wasn't being contained anymore. All of this created a situation where the on-court struggles and off-court tension started feeding into each other.
Losses make everything heavier. Frustration amplifies small issues, and if the environment isn't stable, those problems don't stay small for long. They grow, they spread, and eventually they force decisions that might seem sudden from the outside, but have actually been building for months behind the scenes. And once it reached that point, there was really only one question left for Chicago to answer. How much longer could they afford to let it continue? Eventually, everything that had been building, quietly, gradually, and mostly out of public view, reached a point where it couldn't be managed anymore. For the Chicago Sky, the situation around Angel Reese wasn't just about wins and losses, or even about internal tension. It was about alignment. And by the end of that second season, it was becoming clear that whatever vision the organization had, it no longer matched what was happening on the floor or inside the locker room. The moment that seemed to push things over the edge didn't come from a game, it came from a microphone. In a late-season interview, Reese made it clear she wasn't satisfied with the direction of the team, openly stating that Chicago needed better players and more experienced pieces if they wanted to compete. On its own, that kind of comment might sound like competitive frustration. Athletes say things in the heat of losing. But context matters, and in this case, the context made it land differently. Because those words didn't just float out into the media, they landed directly on the people responsible for building the roster, the front office, the coaching staff, even her own teammates. Whether it was intended that way or not, it came across as a public challenge to the very group she was supposed to be growing with. And once something like that is said out loud, especially in a professional locker room, it doesn't just disappear, it lingers.
From that point on, the tone around the organization started to shift. The patience that teams usually try to maintain with young stars began to wear thin. The idea of figuring it out over time was replaced with a more urgent question. What if this isn't something that can be fixed internally? Because at some point, development stops being about potential and starts being about fit. And if the fit isn't working, no amount of time guarantees that it ever will. So when free agency approached, Chicago didn't behave like a team weighing all its options. They acted like a team that had already made its decision. There were no extended rumors about shopping Reese around the league, no drawn-out negotiations trying to maximize her value. Instead, the move came quickly, and more importantly, it came clean. A deal with the Atlanta Dream centered around future draft picks, not established players, not immediate contributors, just assets that represented flexibility, not certainty. And that detail says everything. Because when a team trades a player with Reese's resume for picks instead of proven talent, it signals a very specific mindset. It means the priority isn't replacing what you lost, it's removing what you had. It means the organization has decided that moving forward, even without a guaranteed return, is better than staying where they are. That's not hesitation, that's conviction. Publicly, the language stayed controlled. Words like roster balance and long-term vision were used to frame the decision. But inside the league, everyone understands how to read between those lines. Front offices rarely say exactly what they mean in these situations, but their actions make it clear. And Chicago's actions suggested that this wasn't just a basketball trade, it was a reset. What makes it even more telling is how little resistance there seemed to be. No reports of competing offers driving up the price, no indication that Chicago was trying to wait for a better deal. They identified a path, took it, and moved on. For a player who, on paper, looked like a centerpiece, that kind of exit is unusual. But the most revealing part wasn't the trade itself, it was what happened immediately after. Because the second Angel Reese was no longer part of the equation, the Chicago Sky didn't ease into a new direction, they accelerated into one. Within days, the same franchise that had struggled to attract meaningful talent suddenly became one of the most active, most decisive teams in the league. And it wasn't just about making moves, it was about the type of players who were suddenly willing to make Chicago their destination. The first signal came fast. Skylar Diggins-Smith, one of the most accomplished guards in the game, didn't hesitate.
This wasn't a fringe signing or a low-risk addition, it was a statement. A veteran who understands the league at the highest level looked at Chicago's situation and chose to step into it. That alone shifted perception. Players like Diggins-Smith don't make decisions blindly. They evaluate culture, stability, direction. And whatever she saw in Chicago after that trade was enough to convince her it was real. Then came Azurá Stevens, a familiar name, someone with history in Chicago, someone who had already experienced success there. Her return wasn't just about basketball, it was about belief. Players don't go back to situations they don't trust, especially not in free agency where options are wide open. Stevens choosing Chicago again suggested that whatever had changed inside the organization wasn't just visible, it was convincing. And it didn't stop. DiJonai Carrington brought defensive intensity and versatility. Rickea Jackson added scoring and offensive creativity. Additional moves followed, each one reinforcing the same idea. This was no longer a team stuck in uncertainty. This was a team building with purpose, adding pieces that complemented each other instead of forcing a system around a single identity. What makes this transformation so striking isn't just the names, it's the timing. These moves didn't unfold over months of careful planning in public view. They happened almost immediately after the roster changed. That kind of speed suggests something had been waiting beneath the surface. Conversations that couldn't fully progress before suddenly moved forward. Opportunities that once felt uncertain suddenly became clear. It's as if the front office had a blueprint ready, but needed the right moment to execute it. And around the league, people noticed, because perception in professional sports shifts quickly, but not without reason. For 2 years, Chicago carried the label of a team players were hesitant to join. Whether it was about fit, culture, or direction, something held them back. Then, almost overnight, that hesitation disappeared. Agents started returning calls. Players started listening differently. The same organization, the same city, but a completely different response. That kind of shift doesn't come from talent alone. It comes from environment, from belief, from the sense that a situation is stable enough and aligned enough to be worth stepping into. And whatever doubts once surrounded Chicago, they clearly weren't strong enough to survive the changes that had just been made.
By the time the dust settled, the Sky didn't just look different, they felt different. The roster had balance, the roles made sense, the energy around the team had changed from uncertain to intentional. Analysts began talking about playoff potential, not long-term rebuilding. And for the first time in a while, Chicago looked like a place where players could actually see themselves succeeding together. Which raises a question that's hard to ignore. If all of this was possible so quickly, why wasn't it possible before? And as Chicago surged forward, building something that suddenly made sense, the focus quietly shifted to the other side of the trade. Because while one franchise seemed to unlock its future, the other was just beginning to deal with questions it didn't expect to face. On paper, the move looked like a win for the Atlanta Dream. Adding Angel Reese to a roster that already had established talent should have elevated them immediately. A dominant rebounder, high motor, constant presence in the paint, those are pieces that usually plug into a contender and make it stronger. And if you just lined up the names, the logic seemed solid. This was a team that had already shown it could compete. Adding another all-star level player should have pushed them closer to the top. But almost as quickly as that idea took shape, a different kind of conversation started to circulate. Around the league, there's always a second layer of information, the kind that doesn't show up in headlines but travels through agents, players, and quiet discussions behind the scenes. And in this case, some reports and league chatter began suggesting that not everyone was viewing Atlanta's new direction the same way it looked on paper. Nothing official, nothing directly confirmed by the organization, but enough hesitation in the air to raise eyebrows.
One of the most talked about developments was the departure of Brittany Griner shortly after the roster shift. Now, to be clear, player movement in free agency can happen for a lot of reasons: fit, personal priorities, contract situations. But timing always matters, and the timing here led to speculation that the direction of the roster may not have aligned with what some veterans were looking for. Again, that's not a confirmed cause and effect, but it's the kind of sequence people around the league notice. And that's where the idea of reputation starts to come into play. In professional sports, especially in a league as connected as the WNBA, locker room dynamics carry weight far beyond one team. Players talk, experiences get shared, and over time, certain perceptions, fair or not, begin to form. They're rarely announced, they don't come with official statements, but they influence decisions in ways that are very real. There's been quiet speculation that some free agents weren't rushing toward Atlanta the way you might expect for a team with playoff-level talent. Not avoiding it outright, not making public statements, but simply choosing other opportunities when given the option. And that kind of response doesn't need to be loud to be significant. Sometimes what doesn't happen tells you just as much as what does. From a basketball standpoint, the questions are just as complicated. Atlanta was already a strong team structurally. Roles were defined. Chemistry, at least on the surface, had been established through a successful regular season. Integrating a high-usage player into that environment isn't always seamless. It requires adjustment, not just from the new addition, but from everyone else. And if those adjustments don't happen naturally, it can create friction that takes time to resolve. None of this means the move won't work. Far from it. Reese's skill set is still valuable. Her energy, her presence on the boards, her competitiveness, those are real strengths that can absolutely contribute to winning in the right system. But the early reaction around the league suggests this wasn't viewed as a simple upgrade. It was seen as a shift, and shifts come with uncertainty. What makes it even more interesting is how differently the two sides of the trade are being discussed. Chicago is being framed as a team that suddenly found clarity. Atlanta, on the other hand, is being viewed with cautious curiosity. Talented, capable, but carrying questions that didn't exist before. And in a league where momentum and perception matter just as much as raw ability, that contrast stands out. Because while one situation raised questions, another provided a clear answer. What Caitlin Clark did with the Indiana Fever didn't just stand out, it redefined expectations almost instantly. She walked into a team that had been sitting at the bottom of the league, a roster with talent but no clear direction, no real identity. And within a single season, everything changed. Not gradually, not in theory, in reality.
The difference wasn't just in production, it was in impact. Clark's numbers were impressive, yes, but that's not what shifted the trajectory of Indiana. It was the way she changed the geometry of the game itself. Defenses had to adjust the moment she crossed half court. Spacing opened up in ways that didn't exist before. Teammates who once struggled to find consistent looks suddenly had room to operate, room to breathe, room to play freely. The offense didn't just run through her, it expanded because of her. And that's the key distinction. Clark didn't just add to the stat sheet, she elevated everything around her. Players like Aaliyah Boston found themselves working with more space inside. Kelsey Mitchell gained cleaner lanes in transition. Role players became more effective simply because the structure of the offense had shifted in their favor. That's what a true franchise-changing presence looks like. It's not just about what you produce, it's about what everyone else becomes when you're on the floor. Now contrast that with what happened in Chicago. For 2 seasons, the Chicago Sky had a player in Angel Reese who, statistically, looked like a centerpiece. But the team around her never experienced that same lift. The spacing didn't evolve, the offense didn't unlock. Teammates didn't suddenly operate at a higher level because of her presence. The numbers were there, but the transformation wasn't. And in today's game, that difference matters more than ever, because teams aren't just looking for production, they're looking for players who change the environment, players who make a franchise more attractive, not just more talented. And that's exactly what happened in Indiana. Free agents started paying attention. The team became relevant again, not just in highlights, but in conversations about where the league was heading. Meanwhile, Chicago spent those same 2 years trying to figure out why things weren't clicking. And by the time they made their decision, Indiana had already moved ahead. They didn't need a complete overhaul. They didn't need to reset their identity. They already had it. They just needed time to grow it. That's what makes this contrast so sharp. One player arrived and accelerated everything. The other, despite all the individual success, couldn't quite bridge the gap between production and progress. And when you line those paths up side by side, it becomes clear why the league started to separate the two conversations. Because this isn't just about talent, it's about trajectory. And right now, those trajectories are moving in very different directions. And that's where this story stops being about a single trade and starts becoming something the entire league is quietly watching. Because even after all the movement, all the signings, and all the speculation, one question still hasn't been fully answered. Not from the Chicago Sky, not from the Atlanta Dream, and definitely not from the players who were closest to it. What exactly did Chicago see? Not on the stat sheet, not in the highlights, but in the moments that don't get recorded, the interactions that don't make headlines, the patterns that only show up when you're inside the building every single day. Because teams don't make decisions like this lightly. They don't move on from a player like Angel Reese with her resume, her visibility, her production, unless they believe keeping her would cost them more than losing her. And everything that followed only made that decision louder. Chicago didn't just move on, they moved forward, fast. The hesitation that once surrounded the franchise disappeared almost overnight. Players who once stayed away suddenly leaned in. The roster didn't just improve, it made sense. And when a transformation happens that quickly, it forces people to look back and reconsider what was really holding things in place before. At the same time, Atlanta stepped into a situation that now carries a different kind of pressure. Because when a move like this becomes the center of league-wide conversation, it's no longer just about fit, it's about proof. Can this version of the Atlanta Dream unlock something that Chicago couldn't? Can they turn potential into actual results? Or will the same questions start to follow them the way they quietly followed Chicago? And then there's the broader contrast that still lingers in the background. The rise of Caitlin Clark with the Indiana Fever showed what it looks like when everything clicks, when a player doesn't just produce, but transforms. That standard now exists, and whether it's fair or not, every emerging star gets measured against it. Which brings everything back to the same unresolved tension. Because reputations in this league don't reset overnight. They don't disappear with a change of jersey or a new city. They travel, they evolve, and sometimes they only become clear when two paths cross again under real pressure. So maybe the trade wasn't the ending people thought it was. Maybe it was just the beginning of something that hasn't fully revealed itself yet. A storyline that's still building, still shifting, still waiting for the moment where everything finally becomes undeniable. And when that moment comes, when these teams meet again, when the stakes are real, and when there's nowhere left to hide, we might finally get the answer to the question everyone's been circling around from the start. What did Chicago see that the rest of the league is still trying not to say out loud?